And greetings, everybody. Keith here. Hoping everybody's having a good day, enjoying life, living life, loving life. Want to remind everybody, hit the like, share, and subscribe. There's a PayPal link down there for anybody that wants to share some love. Every little bit is appreciated. And of course, the StreamYard link is down there for anybody that wants to join the panel. We're going into part 3 of the Trading with the Enemy Act, a century of Trading with the Enemy Act as it relates to the statutes and how they're used as a soft martial law in modern times. So we're going to get into it. Like I said, the link is down there. And we left off the last time. The Trading with the Enemy Act is now the sole bar to the wholesale of dumping into the American market of German goods. And I'm going to say not only German goods, but any other goods that are seized and then brought into the American market, including those of the private American nationals. Notably dyestuffs, coal tar products, and so forth, automobiles, all kinds of things, homes. And the only safeguard absolutely to the existence of the new chemical industry in this country, as we talked about the pharmaceuticals. Operation Paperclip. Thus, temporary seizure had become permanent confiscation, a development that drew complaints even in the United States. Confiscating private property was a relic of barbarism, a job for Vikings, not civilized nations, critics howled. Confiscating private property was a relic of barbarism. If it was a relic of barbarism, then why does it still happen today? Plus, it was counterproductive, particularly if you're taking that property from the American. Would foreigners continue, who are foreigners, to invest in the United States? This is why I mentioned the birth registration standards and the impossibility. See, if there is no birth registration in the United States, then there's no record of such thing. And the record correlates with this because the birth registration is in the state. The state is the one that issues the ID. The ID is relative to the economic warfare involving you in uniform commercial codes known as statutes, which are actually known as Battle of the Forms because you have to fill out official documentation. Would Americans, fearing reprisals, invest abroad or domestically? International lawyers and conservatives commonly made such complaints, but with little impact. During World War II, the United States would seize foreign assets on an even bigger scale. By one reasonable estimate, some $8 billion compared to $500 million in World War I, and hold them after the war's end. In this way, the effects of warfare on private property continued long after wartime had officially ended. Article 10 of the Labor Code tells us that martial law chiefly affects the police and the collection of public revenue and taxes. That's why it's known as a civil police force. The sheriffs are different. More fundamentally, World War I crystallized new conceptions about the relationship between property and war. Economic warfare, of course, was not new, nor was the idea that threats to property might enter into the calculus of going to war in the first place. This is what's going on in these wars. They're economic warfares because those nations have commodities and products and such that they can put on a world market. They don't necessarily want them on a world market. They may want them domestic. Your domestic power is your greatest power and the best aspect to your equity when it comes to the diversity, equity, and inclusion. You get to decide as your local communities who to involve. You're the ones voting these people into office. But private property, even far from the battlefields, seemed newly vulnerable in the 1910s. At the start of the decade, the British author Norman Angel's The Great Illusion, which contended that given growing economic interdependence, modern wars had become economically irrational, and it sold more than 2 million copies. Though the Great War falsified Angel's accompanying prediction that such wars were therefore unlikely to occur, it validated his idea about the complexities of modern international economic relations. No longer could one expect private property to remain unaffected by international conflict. This is in World War II. They made concentration camps for all the Japanese Americans. Shit like that. What do you think reservations are? Moreover, the success of the Allied blockade had proven the power of the economic weapon, and architects of the post-war order made economic sanctions central to their vision of collective security. So, in other words, they were waging economic war by creating economic sanctions. What do you think the UN is all about? Now they can sanction those countries. Every country involved in that UN can be sanctioned, and they're part of that economic warfare. How do you feel about the United States now? Woodrow Wilson, for instance, praised Article 16 of the League Covenant, which called for a mandatory embargo of aggressor nations. After World War I, economic sanctions and other forms of economic warfare would become increasingly important to foreign policy makers. Though the Trading with the Enemy Act survived the end of World War I, it remained, in the eyes of most, a wartime law until 1933. That is when Franklin D. Roosevelt invoked it as legal authority to proclaim a banking holiday. In other words, to temporarily ban all banking transactions. This is also when they brought in the New Deal with all them new programs in the Social Security, and then shortly after that they brought in the UCC in the 1950s. That's so everybody could feel like they were part of that nice mechanism known as the United States, filling out official documentations for all these privileges and benefits, cuckolding to a false patriarch. He cited Section 5B of the Act, which authorized the President to investigate, regulate, or prohibit all financial transactions involving foreign countries. So what happened when they proclaimed a bank holiday on American soil? The origins of 5B are obscure, short, and sketchy, as a Senate committee later described in its legislative history. Congress wrote Section 5B into the Act during a struggle between Commerce and Treasury officials over which department would have authority over enemy financial transactions. Milton C. Elliott, General Counsel of the Federal Reserve Board, offered what became 5B as an amendment. Crucially, its language applied not only to enemies, but also to transactions between the United States and any foreign country. Each state is foreign. Whether enemy, ally of enemy, or otherwise. Pretty ambiguous, meaning it could be an ally as well, under a presumption, which of course would most definitely be false. In 1966, a lawyer who had been one of Eliot's clerks claimed that this broad language was a sleight of hand inserted intentionally so as to ensure that Section 5B survived the war. I would agree. This is very broad. Like I said, it's ambiguous or otherwise. It doesn't say otherwise related to the enemy or associated to the enemy. It just says or otherwise. So one can place a presumption that it would apply to each and every foreign country, which would be each and every state. You know, the Republic of Iowa, as an Iowan, is a foreign nation state, foreign country. In any case, there was little discussion at the time. Legislators appeared to see the act as a law that would be invoked during future wars, but not in times of peace. So what happened when he invoked it in 1933? Were we in war in 1933? If Congress had intended the Trading with the Enemy Act to grant blanket authority to handle domestic economic problems during a time when there was no enemy and no war, no one had said so publicly in 1917. So we see they are already, if Congress had intended the Trading with the Enemy Act to grant blanket authority to handle domestic economic problems during a time when there was no enemy. So if there is a time when there is an enemy, the blanket authority is that they can handle domestic economic problems. Where's all this foreign stuff? See? What is domestic to the United States? See, this is why that Constitution says the states can't print and mint their own coins and money. They become part of the domestic economic warfare and part of the domestic economic problem against the very people that are dependent on a good economic country, a good economic stability. And like I said many times, folks, if you think this is a powerful nation and the average reading comprehension is that of a 7th or 8th grader, you are certainly confused. Roosevelt's stretching of the law thus often serves as an exhibit in accounts of the rise of unaccountable executive power and the exceptional malleability of law. They're telling you right here, this is Cambridge University Press, guys, 2018. But how exactly did the Trading with the Enemy Act wind up as the justification for the bank holiday? 1932, the General Counsel of the Federal Reserve Board, Walter Wyatt, had produced a memorandum asserting that 5B granted the authority to halt domestic financial transactions. That's what I was talking about earlier. Where did they get the authority to halt the domestic transaction? Everything we've seen so far was for the foreign authorities as sanctions. And so when you halt the financial transactions domestically, it operates the same way as a sanction, making your own people destitute. This is why we see those bread lines and stuff in countries in the past. President Herbert Hoover's Attorney General, William D. Mitchell, was skeptical, but after showing Wyatt's memorandum, he grudgingly conceded that 5B offered sufficient color of authority if the president felt that the emergency justified it. Mitchell added, however, that he thought the legality of the executive order rested on only a shoestring, and advised President Hoover not to invoke the act unless the incoming Democratic Congress would promise to uphold it. Does that sound like a conspiracy, folks? But Senator Carter Glass doubted whether Trading with the Enemy Act could be applied in peacetime. Wary of being overturned by Congress, Hoover decided not to act. Roosevelt had fewer scruples about presidential power. His administration issued executive orders at an unprecedented pace, 1,486 in the first term alone. How many is that a day? That's 4 of them a day. And you have to be on the clock 365 days a year to do that. Think about that, folks. Who in their right mind can pass 1,486 executive orders in a 365-day year, 4 years in a row? Well, I guess I was off there. That's one a day. It's one a day, working every day. He often justified his actions by comparing economic crisis to wartime. But where is the legislation that says the economic crisis in peacetime can be held as despotic against your own people? Domestically. How do you justify that? Indeed, he first discovered Wyatt's memo and the potential of the Trading with the Enemy Act when he asked an aide to search out powers left over from the war that might be used to fight the Depression. And in his inaugural address, perhaps alluding to the act, he promised to ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage war against the emergency. So now an emergency becomes war. As great as the power that would be given to me if we weren't in fact invaded by a foreign foe. So they wage a war on drugs. Wage a war on racism. See, these are declarations of emergency first, folks. You get out there and protest, start lighting shit on fire, it's emergency. They had to call the emergency department. They had to call 911. Fucking heathens. Roosevelt hoped to fit his emergency actions into a constitutional framework. Hasn't been done. Trading with the Enemy Act, just like any other statute, code, rule, regulation, has to be consistent with the Constitution. You can't just fit it in and say, well, it violates this, but we're going to put it in there anyway. So when you violate logic by declaring an emergency in order to declare a war, to provide the sanctions on said emergency, it proves that you're creating a war instead of helping with emergency care. That's a general welfare. domestic tranquility, national defense. And that's in the preamble, folks. These are simple concepts. Upon learning of Wyatt's memo, he sought multiple legal opinions. The incoming Attorney General, Homer Cummings, skipped most of the inauguration in order to read the legislative history of the act. Roosevelt wrote in his diary that his advisors had considered and rejected 48 different methods of solving the banking crisis before Attorney General Cummings reported favorably on power to act under the 1917 law. They never said that this was a method of solving the banking crisis. It's a method to wage war so they can do what they will. It's a supply and demand for a reason, folks. These men deemed it important to provide a legal justification for their actions, and the presence of the Trading with the Enemy Act made that easier than it otherwise might have been. So they don't need a war justification. They need a legal justification because it's a legal sanction. The identification system, Interstate Identification Index, FBI. Congress also legitimized the president's unilateral actions by passing the Emergency Banking Act just 3 days after Roosevelt's proclamation. The House acted in record time, voting unanimously after an abbreviated 40 minutes of debate. The Senate approved the legislation 3 hours later before copies of the bill had even been printed. I am so impressed with the necessity of the case that I'm not even going to mention those things to which I take exception. The things that might violate your rights. We're going to go ahead and pass this legislation despite that. We know that it might put you in a desperate situation, having to shut down all the domestic bank accounts so we can control our shit. But maybe you shouldn't be such a fucking bitch-ass slave and cut to a false patronymical system. Sorry, did I say that? The Emergency Banking Act both blessed Roosevelt's legal manipulations and transformed the Trading with the Enemy Act in consequential ways. Section 1 explicitly approved and confirmed the President's actions, while Section 2 amended 5B of the 1917 measure to clarify that the President could invoke the Act's powers. All done by Roosevelt himself. And the House said, sure, we'll let you do that. That wasn't put as a vote before the people. They didn't have a say in it. Tell me again how your fucking vote counts, people. During time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the President. The law now explicitly authorized peacetime use. Pretty quick. Within a few years, the implications of this shift became clear. On December 12, 1937, during its war with China, Japan bombed and strafed the USS Panay, a U.S. Navy gunboat anchored in the Yangtze River above Nanking. Hoping to quarantine the Japanese, Roosevelt asked Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. to find a way to cut off the flow of funds to Japan. One way to do that is if you have people living domestically, Japanese, making money in America and sending it home to their Japanese relatives, you can sanction your own domestic people. Funny how that works. You really want to keep paying tribute to this false patronymical system, folks? This melting pot? Morgenthau's general counsel, Herman Oliphant, produced a secret memorandum holding that the Trading with the Enemy Act permitted the president to declare a national emergency and prohibit foreign exchange. And I remind you, every last one of you is foreign. And when you take upon that United States identification through the state, that resident for income tax purposes, they just shut down business as a whole. Now what are you going to do? Oliphant, Harry Dexter White, and other advisors persuaded Morgenthau that such an action would enable a complete economic blockade of Japan. When Morgenthau shared the memo with Roosevelt, the president was surprised to see the reference to the Trading with the Enemy Act. My God, I completely forgot about it. Yeah, see, it's such a great thing. Roosevelt ultimately decided not to invoke the wartime law in 1937, but he remembered its potential from that point forward. In April 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, American officials worried that the Nazis might make use of Danish and Norwegian assets held in the United States. Morgenthau convinced the president to invoke the Trading with the Enemy Act, which he did in Executive Order 8389 on April 10, 1940. Bernard Bernstein, an assistant Oliphant at the Treasury, then took the old documents that had been drafted for Japan in 1937 and rewrote them to apply to Denmark and Norway. So they simply used what had already been drafted as a draft for another one. Some government lawyers believe that Section 5B of the Act only applied to bank transfers and could not be used to free securities themselves. But Bernstein convinced Attorney General Robert Jackson of the law's broader writ. Doesn't matter if it's bank transfers or securities themselves, they are assets. On May 7th, Congress amended the Trading with the Enemy Act to ratify Roosevelt's actions and make clear its application to securities. And this marked the beginning of the Foreign Funds Control System, administered by a new office in the department, or the Treasury Department. See, when you're using that monetary system and you're dependent on any kind of account, it's done through a treasury, and they can control that in all of its branches, whether it be known as a Federal Reserve Bank or a credit union or any otherwise. The asset freeze would subsequently apply to every new country invaded by the Germans, and by June 1941 to virtually all of Europe. Meanwhile, the Trading with the Enemy Act loomed over U.S. negotiations with Japan. Concerned about Japanese plans to expand into Southeast Asia, as well as its continuing war in China, Washington turned to economic coercion. Mostly this took the form of export controls. Washington made it more difficult for Japan to obtain sufficient supplies or refined gasoline, scrap metal, and other strategic goods, for example. See, they don't have the gross domestic product of producing the things that they needed to consummate the war. They were dependent upon other nations. So in contract form, trading with the enemy, you can contract people out. But in July 1941, after Japanese forces invaded southern Indochina, Roosevelt invoked the Trading with the Enemy Act to freeze Japanese assets. See, here they use assets rather than securities or bank transactions. Though the president hoped to maintain some flexibility, to license some shipments of goods in return for Japanese diplomatic concessions. Mid-level officials led by Dean Acheson interpreted the president's order so strictly as to make it impossible for Japan to use gold reserves it had amassed to purchase oil and other necessities. See what the gold clause is about? It has everything to do with Trading with the Enemy Act, the Emergency Banking Act. Japanese hardliners cited these actions in convincing their colleagues to launch their attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. After the U.S. declaration of war, Congress once again amended the Trading with the Enemy Act. This was necessary, as one observer pointed out, because the legislative mind was in a state of great vagueness. That's why I was mentioning ambiguity and the otherwise about the status of the 1917 law. Section 5B certainly remained in effect, but was the rest of the law still applicable during wartime? As part of the first War Powers Act, which passed within a week of being introduced, Congress amended Section 5B to grant President vaster powers, again expanding it, including the ability to seize foreign property, meaning that such property could be licensed, liquidated, or sold. That's an investment. Investment. Importantly, the revised act clearly applied to all foreign countries, not merely enemy ones. I made that distinction earlier as well. Read the language. Otherwise. So otherwise means not merely enemy ones. It was ambiguous and includes everyone else. They merely needed to say includes everyone, and could be invoked during the time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the president. But this part was added on. It wasn't in the original part. Influenced by that transformation of governmental power during the New Deal, as I mentioned, as well as the growing recognition of the value of the economic warfare, Congress seemed comfortable granting this broad power to the executive. And what it did, folks, like I said, that New Deal, it allowed every common man, woman, and child to partake in the military construct of a commercial system for certain protections while using that military fiat. In using that military fiat, you become part of that very economic warfare. That's the statistics that says because they use this fiat currency and it's in this use and it's this broad, this is what it does. Now you're stuck. Like I said, what happens when they do a domestic freeze? Another bank emergency. What are you going to do? It's their system. You have to learn how to become dependent on your own assets, which are your true talents, which is the Lord's money, and that's done in peace. Unlike the original act in 1917, this amended version was designated to continue to function in peacetime. As a lawyer noted in 1943, the amended act looks far ahead, foreshadowing and forestalling events to meet not only wartime exigencies, but national peacetime emergencies as well. If it's to meet peacetime emergencies on the national level, domestically, then there should be the foreshadowing, in other words, foreplanning of a backup of something, so that you don't end up with the homeless veterans, people starving. I mean, this is a great nation, right? Oh, wait a minute. How do you help somebody from starving themselves and being drug addicts and dumbasses and Slav slaves and being transgenders and not being able to keep their mind straight? If your mind is only the mentality of a 7th or 8th grader, according to the average reading comprehension of Americans, I find it hard to believe. So yeah, they can get one over on you really easy now, and you're letting them. You become part of that system. By 1945, there's little that U.S. presidents could not do, legally speaking. Again, it's all illegal. What does the president have outside of legal? All has to do with those contracts, folks. In the realm of economic warfare. Economics is dependent upon the contracts. That's your commercial system entirely, including the banks, the stores, the cashiers, the people playing in it, all the people with IDs and cards that are running this stuff. By declaring the existence of a national emergency, the definition of which was left up to presidents themselves. So we see here recently in the past few years, they started sanctioning people for a medical emergency. Don't you get it? They could regulate or ban entirely virtually all financial transactions. They could not only seize and hold foreign-owned property, but dispose of it as they saw fit. That sounds like a violation of the Fifth Amendment, folks. Wartime offices tasked with implementing sanctions and foreign funds control blossom into a permanent bureaucratic apparatus. Bureau. Created with the Trading with the Enemy Act authority and now located primarily in the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control. In the Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Asset Control. During the Cold War, the Act underwrote, that's an insurance terminology, underwrote an expansive program of economic warfare. It's a program of economic warfare. In 1950, after the outbreak of hostilities in Korea, President Harry Truman declared a national emergency under the Trading with the Enemy Act to enforce sanctions against North Korea and China. That emergency remained in place for 25 years. Then what did we have? In 1975, good old Jimmy Carter's coming in, and all of a sudden we have another run where we have gas lines and bread lines. Both my parents worked for the federal government. Somehow we managed to be qualified to go down to the goddamn cheese line. It was amazing. During which time Section 5B also justified sanctions against Vietnam, Cambodia, and Cuba. Sanctions disrupted existing trade relationships and took other concrete tolls. For instance, Office of Foreign Asset Control ensured that products of communist China, such as shrimp, tofu, and hog hair bristles, did not reach American shores. The law also had other unexpected outcomes. To take just 3 of many possible examples, OFAC prevented Williams College from retrieving a 14th century Chinese painting it had loaned to a Canadian art exhibition. It sequestered Eldridge Cleaver's book royalties, and it barred philatelists from importing Chinese and Korean stamps. Interesting. That's my issue, is the stamps. See, everybody wants to make fun of me about you can make homemade stamps. If you understand how this system works, you most certainly can. Sanction programs authorized by Trading with the Enemy Act also enhance the reach of U.S. global power by instituting worldwide programs of economic surveillance. What do you think that fucking idea is, folks? I'm telling you, they started here domestically first. And control. U.S. global power by instituting worldwide programs of economic surveillance and control. That's the U.S. wanting to control worldwide programs of economic surveillance. Sounds to me like they want to control the world economics. That sounds like the New World Order that we spoke of in the first video. Enforcing the embargo on China proved particularly nettlesome because it was difficult to determine whether goods exported from Hong Kong and other Asian countries had actually been produced in China. As one American official later recalled, how about if the chicken comes from communist China and is brought across the border into Hong Kong live and lays the egg on the Hong Kong side? Is that then a communist product? OFAC responded by creating a category of Chinese type goods. So, Chinese type or otherwise goods that might have come from China. Any such items presumed to have Chinese origins were thus inadmissible. Presumed. To the United States without a special certificate of non-Chinese production. Indian lychee nuts and Japanese soy sauce fell victim to this designation. In one case, these regulations stopped the import of paintings produced by Chinese refugees in Hong Kong, which the Anti-Communist League of America had hoped to sell in the United States to raise funds for its crusade against Red China. So they effectively cut off a funding foot in the fight against the communism. That's that domestic terrorism, folks. It's terrible. Sanctions formed part of a broader program of economic warfare that operated alongside military alliances, diplomatic initiatives, and covert operations during the Cold War. And notice, the Cold War is a time of no war. It was the sanctions. It was this is when they were practicing these economic warfare sanctions. They were instituting different contract clauses in determining who gets what and why and where. Ironically, notes Alan Dobson, it was the free market USA that looked most often to economic sanctions, embargoes, cold economic warfare, and economic warfare as a means of exerting influence in international affairs. Again, I want to ask you if you're proud of paying tribute to this false patriarchal United States and its economic warfare program of economic warfare. With the United Nations Security Council deadlocked between the United States and Soviet Union, virtually all U.S. sanctions programs function either unilaterally or with Cold War allies. Their effects were mixed. Their effects are not mixed when it comes to the domestic effects, though. Don't miss that. The domestic effects are never missed. Trading with the Enemy Act and the identification is part of the program. It's an economic identification for economic purposes under the statistics. State's vital statistics jurisdiction, established at the enumeration at birth, which creates the legal name that's on those documents, those official documents. The vast majority of sanctions, scholars have found, failed to achieve their ultimate goals. Embargoes on Cuba and China did not dislodge communist governments. The strategic embargo on the USSR did little to hinder the Soviet military buildup. Yet sanctions did sometimes provide U.S. policymakers with leverage. So sometimes they're provided with leverage, and that's U.S. policymakers get provided that leverage, and not the people. Again, how much does your vote count? Frozen assets could be exchanged for expropriated American properties, and sanctions might be loosened or tightened as part of larger negotiations. In the lead up to U.S. rapprochement with China in 1971, for instance, the Treasury Department gradually relaxed the Chinese embargo, allowing tourist purchases and even removing the Chinese-type goods designation from certain articles. Throughout the Cold War, the Trading with the Enemy Act's authority was exercised pursuant to the declared existence of national emergency. Throughout the Cold War, the Trading with the Enemy Act's authority was exercised pursuant to the declared existence of a national emergency. So don't tell me that the national emergencies weren't there, and they are. They're still in effect. 28 of them as of 2017. In the early years, some doubts about unilateral executive control of these powers lingered. In 1950, while noting that the law granted the power to restrict Soviet imports, a State Department employee fretted that Congress would not favor use of this act for the purpose now being discussed. They were recognizing a different use, a different intent. And as late as 1954, a legal advisor warned against appointing the Trading with the Enemy Act for anything other than a most serious type of situation, because doing so might result in curtailment of the authority itself. Legal advisor warned against appointing the Trading with the Enemy Act for anything other than a most serious type situation, because doing so might result in curtailment of the authority itself. That 10th Amendment, folks, the powers so delegated in the Constitution of the United States and not restricted in it, are delegated by the people first. Nowhere else do they come from. They don't just magically pop into thin air in the Constitution. It didn't grant itself its authority. The executive's emergency powers seem reliant on at least implicit consent of Congress and the public. There's going to come a time, no matter how much Congress wants to agree with the president, that this part is going to put a curtailment to the authority. It's natural. It happens throughout history. It repeats itself. Yet, as the Cold War continued, public faith in executive power grew. You were deceived. In 1959, Gallup poll statistics found 61% of respondents favoring the expansion of presidential authority, compared to only 17% who wanted Congress to have more power. 61% of the people favoring the expansion of presidential authority, in favoring the expansion of power into one man, instead of the sensible, reasonable, logical keeping that power with Congress. Again, does your vote really count then? And the public? Academics and constitutional scholars argue that the nation needed a strong executive to organize and unify its people and the public. So that strong executive can't be stronger than the people. No way in hell. And if it poses it is, and places sanctions against those people that delegated such powers, that would be tyranny. I'm going to repeat it again. That would be tyranny. I'm not going to speak lightly of this. This, again, is a simple concept. Academics and constitutional scholars argued that the nation needed a strong executive to organize and unify its people. Congress, as a political scientist, Clinton Rossiter explained in 1956, was no longer reminded or organized to guide itself. Truman's decision to use force against North Korea in 1950 without asking Congress to declare war stood as a new precedent, which generated surprisingly little second guessing. By 1960, as the Eisenhower administration debated how to respond to Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution, officials worried more about the Trading with the Enemy Act's ramifications on relations with U.S. allies. Eisenhower balked at invoking the act because it would mean designating Cuba as an enemy, which might undermine the administration's attempts to isolate Castro in the hemisphere. More importantly, while canceling Cuba's sugar import quota could be justified as the defense of American property in response to Cuban nationalizations, invoking the Trading with the Enemy Act would constitute a clear act of economic warfare. So, when the government imposes an economic sanction domestically through a program of economic warfare, I don't care if you want to call it a medical emergency, a war on drugs, a bank emergency, I don't care. You are the one declaring war on the very people that put you in that office. Again, I'm not going to be light about this. I've never voted. I would never do such a stupid thing. We have to have more reasonable people that are more qualified to fill such capacities before I would ever think about voting. And in a nation where the average reading comprehension is about 7th or 8th grade, I find it hard to believe while watching some of these people in these political offices. And you don't see what I see? Shameful. A unilateral act of this sort would undermine the multilateral foundations of the Rio Treaty, a 1947 hemispheric mutual defense agreement, and might drive other Latin American states in the Castro's camp, allowing that communist organization to grow. Combined with the fact that Cuba had relatively little trade or property left to seize in the United States, the Eisenhower and then the Kennedy administrations resisted invoking the act until 1963. Concerns about international impacts persisted. In 1970, one State Department memorandum listed the Trading with the Enemy Act as a possible source of authority for economic measures to counter the rise of airplane hijacking. So now there's a travel emergency. Yet diplomatic officials also cautioned against its use. Invoking the act was the equivalent of economic war, warned a report prepared for Henry Kissinger. No major industrial power uses any instrument of this intensity. The United States and every other country around the world uses the identification to such intensity, and that is instrumental in that economic warfare. You have been programmed. Still, because the law offered broad emergency powers, it could be used as a backstop when other authorities lapsed. On 4 separate occasions between 1972 and 1976, Congress failed to reauthorize the Export Administration Act of 1969 before it expired. The EAA had provided important statutory authority for banning strategic exports to the Soviet bloc. So because this failed, they instituted the Trading with the Enemy Act to ban strategic exports to the Soviet bloc, because this no longer was in effect. It had no authority. Declaring the loss of this authority as constituting an emergency, President Nixon and Ford cited Section 5B of the Trading with the Enemy Act to keep the EAA provisions in place. This pattern became so routine that some observers blamed the existence of 5B for Congress's inability to reauthorize the legislation in the first place. Confident in the Trading with the Enemy Act's powers, the administration had no incentive to press for its extension, one congressman observed. Confident in the Trading with the Enemy Act's powers. Where does the Trading with the Enemy Act get its powers? That supply and demand, that statistical economic plan. And of course, everybody's got to line up in the cheese line one day or another, so you better have your government ID just in case. In the meantime, you can have a government ID to participate in this nice wealth system and defer a debt because you're a debtor, because you don't have any real credit. That's what this system placates, and that's what you fall to as a secret agent, man. Yeah, I got this ID. It's a military government ID, and you won't accept that without understanding and comprehending the gravity of it. It's a United States business under a military government. It's martial law, and martial law chiefly affects the police and the collection of public revenue and taxes for the expelled army or the invading forces, for its army, the safety of its army, and the safety of its operations. Not you. So I'll be back again tomorrow night with another video on the next part of the Trading with the Enemy Act. I may have to do a 5th video. So at least be watching again tomorrow night for the next video. And with that, we are finished. And you guys know me. I love you, but I don't give a rat's ass whether you love me back. So may God bless you and have a good night.